The emergency klaxon pierced through the humid morning air at Hickam Air Force Base, its wailing cry cutting across the flight line like a blade through silk. Ground crews scattered as the massive C-17 Globemaster taxied toward the runway, its four Pratt& and Whitney engines screaming their metallic song of urgency. Inside the cockpit, Captain Marcus Bulldog Richardson gripped the yoke with white knuckles, his breathing shallow and labored. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his vision blurred at the edges. The mission was critical, a humanitarian aid drop over the remote islands of Micronesia, where Typhoon Vera had left thousands stranded without supplies. But something was terribly wrong. "Tower, this is Cargo 77 requesting immediate medical assistance," Richardson's co-pilot, Lieutenant Torres, transmitted with barely controlled panic. "We have a pilot experiencing severe chest pains, possible cardiac event." The radio crackled back. "Cargo 77 returned to base immediately. Emergency crews standing by." But Richardson shook his head violently, his face ashen. "Negative," he wheezed into his headset. "Those people, they're dying down there. Storm knocked out their communications 3 days ago. We're their only hope." The medical officer rushed aboard as they held position on the taxiway, his kit bouncing against his hip. One look at Richardson and his expression darkened. "Captain, you need immediate hospitalization. This isn't happening." But Richardson's eyes blazed with desperate determination. "Then find me another pilot, now." The medical officer shook his head grimly. "Sir, every qualified pilot is either deployed or grounded for maintenance checks. The next available crew won't be ready for 18 hours. Silence fell like a shroud over the aircraft. 18 hours meant death for the survivors below, children, elderly, wounded clinging to life in a devastation zone where hope came measured in supply drops. The C-17's massive cargo hold contained 40,000 pounds of medical supplies, clean water, and emergency food. It sat there, tantalizingly close to salvation, yet impossibly far from the people who needed it most. That's when she appeared at the aircraft's entry door, her slight frame silhouetted against the harsh Hawaiian sunlight. She wore civilian clothes, faded jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through fire and emerged unburned. The ground crew barely noticed her as she climbed aboard, but the medical officer looked up in confusion. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You need to." She held up a military ID that made his words die in his throat. The photo was 7 years old, but the eyes were unmistakable, sharp, intelligent, carrying the weight of secrets that most people would never understand. "I'm Major Elena Phoenix Vasquez," she said quietly, her voice carrying the hint of an accent that spoke of desert winds and distant mountains. "And I believe you need a pilot." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Everyone aboard the aircraft knew that name, knew the legend, knew the story that had become whispered folklore in pilot-ready rooms from Langley to Ramstein. Phoenix, the ghost pilot who had vanished over the mountains of Afghanistan 7 years ago, declared missing in action, presumed dead after her F-16 Fighting Falcon had been shot down during a classified operation. Her aircraft had been found weeks later, a twisted wreck in a remote valley, but her body had never been recovered. The Air Force had held a memorial service. Her squadron had retired her call sign. Her parents had buried an empty coffin. Yet here she stood, very much alive, studying the C-17's instrument panel with the casual familiarity of someone reading a familiar book. The medical officer stammered, "Ma'am, your records show. I mean, you've been declared." She turned to face him, and her smile was sad but determined. "Dead. Yeah, I got that memo. But right now people are dying, and you have a perfectly good aircraft that needs someone to fly it." She gestured toward Richardson, who was now being strapped to a gurney. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to their families why help was sitting on the tarmac while they suffocated under bureaucratic red tape." Lieutenant Torres found his voice first. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you've been out of active duty for 7 years. Flight certification, currency requirements, aircraft familiarization. Phoenix moved to the left seat with fluid precision, her hands already beginning the pre-flight checklist from memory. Lieutenant, I've been flying relief missions in some very unfriendly places for the past 7 years. Different uniform, same mission. Her fingers danced across the switches and displays with practiced efficiency. The C-17 handles like a pregnant elephant compared to what I'm used to, but the principles remain the same. Besides, she glanced at the medical supplies filling the cargo hold, those people down there don't care about my paperwork. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Williams, climbed aboard with a tablet displaying weather data and flight plans. He paused when he saw Phoenix in the pilot's seat, his weathered face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching awe. "Phoenix," he whispered, "sweet mother of, we thought you were dead." She looked up from the checklist, and for just a moment vulnerability flickered across her features. "I was, Sergeant, in every way that mattered. But sometimes the dead have work left to do." Richardson was being wheeled off the aircraft, his hand weakly grasping toward Phoenix as the gurney passed. "The winds," he gasped. "Crosswinds at the drop zone are gusting to 40 knots. The approach is through a mountain pass, and the locals rigged the landing zone markers with whatever they could find. It's not a standard setup." Phoenix nodded grimly. "I've landed in worse places with worse weather and no markers at all, Captain. Rest easy. Your mission will be completed." As the medical team rushed Richardson toward the waiting ambulance, Phoenix turned to Torres. "I assume you're current and qualified on this bird." Torres nodded, still processing the surreal situation. "Yes, ma'am. 18 months as co-pilot on C-17s, 200 hours in type." Phoenix's expression softened slightly. "Good. I'll need your eyes on the instruments and your voice on the radio. Where I've been, trust was the difference between mission success and becoming a statistic. Can I trust you, Lieutenant?" The young officer straightened unconsciously. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." Phoenix began the engine start sequence, the familiar whine of turbines spinning up filling the cockpit. Then, "Let's go save some lives." The tower controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "Cargo 77, be advised your flight plan shows Major Vasquez as pilot in command. Can you confirm this is accurate?" Phoenix keyed the microphone, her voice steady and professional. "Tower, this is Phoenix. I'm qualified, I'm current where it matters, and I'm the pilot available right now. Those coordinates contain people who are running out of time. Request immediate clearance for departure." A long pause filled the airwaves. In the background, they could hear heated discussion, multiple voices debating protocols and procedures while precious minutes ticked away. Finally, a different voice came through, older, carrying the authority of rank and experience. "Phoenix, this is Colonel Martinez, base commander. Your records show MIA, presumed KIA. I need some kind of explanation before I can authorize this flight." Phoenix's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, with respect, explanations are a luxury those people below can't afford. I'm here, I'm qualified, and every minute we spend talking is a minute less of survival time for civilians in a disaster zone. You can court-martial me when I get back, but right now, I need wheels up." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Torres watched Phoenix's profile, nodding the way her eyes never left the instruments, the way her hands remained steady on the controls despite the tension crackling through the radio. Whatever she had experienced in those 7 years of official death, it had forged her into something harder, more focused, carrying an intensity that seemed to bend reality around her will. The engines reached full power, the aircraft straining against its brakes like a caged animal desperate for release. "Cargo 77, Martinez's voice finally returned, heavy with resignation and responsibility. "You are cleared for takeoff. God help us all." Phoenix didn't smile, but something in her posture relaxed slightly. "Thank you, sir. See you on the flip side." She released the brakes, and the massive transport aircraft lurched forward, accelerating down the runway with gathering momentum. As the wheels left the tarmac and Hawaii fell away beneath them, Torres couldn't help but wonder what kind of hell had forged the woman beside him. and whether they were flying towards salvation or something far more dangerous. The C-17 climbed steadily through scattered clouds, its shadow racing across the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. Phoenix flew with an economy of movement that spoke of thousands of hours in hostile airspace, her scan pattern automatic, her communication brief and professional. But Torres noticed things, the way she unconsciously favored her left shoulder, the thin scar that disappeared beneath her collar, the slight tremor in her right hand that only appeared when she thought no one was watching. These were the marks of someone who had survived things that broke other people. "So," Torres ventured carefully, "where exactly have you been for 7 years?" Phoenix's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Places that don't exist on official maps, Lieutenant. Doing things that never happened for people who were never there." Her voice carried no bitterness, just the flat acceptance of someone who had made peace with necessary secrets. "After my F-16 went down, I was listed as KIA because that was easier for everyone involved. The mission I was flying, the territory I was in, the people I was working with, all of it was compartmentalized beyond most people's clearance levels." She adjusted their heading slightly, compensating for upper-level winds that were pushing them off course. "I spent 2 years in a Pakistani hospital, learning to walk again after the ejection. When I was mobile, certain people made me an offer. Keep flying, keep making a difference, but do it in places where official military presence would create international incidents. So I did." Torres processed this information, understanding that he was being trusted with something that could probably get them both in significant trouble. "And now?" he asked quietly. Phoenix was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Now I'm tired, Lieutenant. Tired of being a ghost, tired of fighting wars that don't exist, tired of being officially dead while being more alive than I'd ever been. When I heard about this mission on the radio this morning, when I realized lives were hanging in the balance because of bureaucracy and bad timing." She trailed off, then continued more firmly. "Sometimes you reach a point where doing the right thing matters more than keeping your cover." The radio crackled with an update from the disaster zone. Australian rescue coordinators were painting a grim picture. The typhoon had devastated 3 small islands, washing away most structures and contaminating the fresh water supply. Over 600 people were stranded, including a missionary hospital that had been treating wounded from the initial storm. Medical supplies were critically low, and several patients wouldn't survive another day without the antibiotics and blood products loaded in their cargo hold. Phoenix absorbed this information with professional calm, but Torres saw her grip tighten almost imperceptibly on the yoke. "What's our ETA to the drop zone?" she asked, her voice betraying nothing of the pressure building inside the aircraft. Torres consulted his navigation display. "Current speed and heading, we're looking at 4 hours, 37 minutes. Phoenix nodded, then keyed the radio to contact the Australian coordinator. "Rescue Control, this is Cargo 77 en route your position with medical supplies and emergency provisions. Can you provide current weather conditions at the drop zone?" The Australian accent was thick with exhaustion and barely controlled desperation. "Cargo 77, winds are currently gusting to 45 knots with embedded thunderstorms moving through the area. The improvised landing zone is a cleared area approximately 1,200 meters long, but it's soft ground, recently flooded. We've marked it with vehicle headlights and emergency flares, but visibility is limited." Phoenix exchanged a glance with Torres. Those were challenging conditions for any aircraft, let alone a massive cargo transport loaded to maximum weight. "Understood, Rescue Control. Do you have any aircraft currently in the area?" A pause then. "Negative, Cargo 77. Weather has grounded all local aviation assets. You're the only flight inbound." The weight of that statement settled over the cockpit like a heavy blanket. Phoenix's expression remained neutral, but Torres could sense the calculation happening behind her eyes: wind speeds, aircraft performance, payload considerations, and the lives hanging in the balance below. "Lieutenant," Phoenix said quietly, I want you to pull up the aircraft performance charts for maximum weight landings on unpaved surfaces. Also get me the weather radar picture for our destination." As Torres worked the displays, Phoenix continued the descent, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to fly in conditions where mistakes meant death. The ocean stretched endlessly below them, and somewhere ahead, people were counting minutes in terms of heartbeats, praying for the sound of aircraft engines that might or might not come in time. The weather radar painted an ominous picture ahead, a solid line of red and yellow cells stretching across their flight path, with towering cumulonimbus clouds that reached well above their current altitude. Phoenix studied the display with the calm focus of someone who had flown through worse, but Torres felt his stomach tighten with anticipation. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "those storms look pretty intense. Should we consider holding for better conditions?" Phoenix's response was immediate and definitive. "Negative. Those people don't have time to wait for perfect weather." She adjusted their heading to thread between the worst of the cells, her voice taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions in compressed timeframes. "Besides, Lieutenant, I've flown through monsoons in mountains where the peaks disappeared into the clouds and the valleys were full of people shooting at you. A little Pacific weather isn't going to stop this mission." As if summoned by her words, the first wisps of cloud began to streak past their windows, and the aircraft shuddered slightly as they entered the outer edges of the storm system. The turbulence began as a gentle bouncing, but quickly intensified into the kind of violent shaking that made conversation difficult and concentration essential. Phoenix rode the controls with practiced ease, making constant small adjustments to keep them on course and maintain the optimal descent profile. Torres found himself gripping his armrests, watching the instruments dance as the aircraft was buffeted by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Lightning flickered outside their windows, illuminating towering walls of cloud that rose like mountainous cathedrals around them. "Cargo 77, be advised radar shows you're entering a severe weather cell. Recommend immediate deviation to the south." The voice belonged to an air traffic controller somewhere in the region, monitoring their progress on long-range radar. Phoenix keyed her microphone without hesitation. "Negative on the deviation. We're committed to this approach. The people below don't have time for us to go around the weather." Torres looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Everything about her body language suggested complete confidence, but he could see the way she unconsciously adjusted her shoulder harness, the way her eyes never stopped moving across the instrument panel. The storm hit them with the full fury of nature unleashed. Rain drummed against the windscreen with machine gun intensity, while wind shear tried to tear the aircraft apart. Phoenix's hands moved constantly on the controls, fighting to maintain their heading as updrafts and downdrafts slammed them with forces that would have overwhelmed a lesser pilot. The C-17 groaned and creaked around them, its massive frame flexing under stresses that pushed every system to its limits. Torres watched the artificial horizon spin crazily, his inner ear confused by the constant motion, but Phoenix never wavered. "There," she said suddenly, pointing through the rain-lashed windscreen. 10 o'clock low. Torres peered into the gloom and gradually made out lights, not the organized pattern of a proper airfield, but the desperate improvisation of people marking a landing zone with whatever illumination they could muster. Vehicle headlights, emergency flares, even what looked like campfires formed a rough rectangle in the darkness below. It was barely visible through the storm, a fragile beacon of hope in an ocean of chaos. Phoenix began the approach checklist, her voice steady despite the aircraft's violent motion. "Flaps 20 degrees, landing gear down, approach speed 140 indicated." Torres responded mechanically, his training taking over even as his mind struggled to process what they were attempting. Landing a fully loaded C-17 on a makeshift strip in a storm was the kind of challenge that turned experienced pilots into cautionary tailies. But something in Phoenix's demeanor suggested she had done impossible things before and survived to tell about them. The winds at the surface were even worse than reported, with crosswind components that pushed them far off the center line of the improvised runway. Phoenix corrected with smooth, confident inputs, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft aligned. 50 feet, Torres called out, watching the radar altimeter count down their height above the ground. 40, 30, 20. The lights rushed up to meet them, and Phoenix flared the massive aircraft with a precision that spoke of innate skill honed by years of flying in impossible conditions. The main landing gear touched down with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the airframe. Immediately, Phoenix deployed the thrust reversers, their roar adding to the cacophony of wind and rain. The aircraft shuddered and bucked as it decelerated on the soft, waterlogged ground, but Phoenix kept it tracking straight through pure force of will and flying skill. They rolled to a stop just short of the tree line, the massive transport sitting incongruously in a field that had been underwater just days before. "Welcome to paradise, Lieutenant," Phoenix said dryly as she began the engine shutdown checklist. Outside their windows, figures were already running toward the aircraft, their forms barely visible through the driving rain. These were the survivors, the people who had been counting on them, who had probably given up hope of rescue until they heard the sound of jet engines cutting through the storm. As the cargo ramp lowered with a hydraulic whine, Phoenix turned to Torres with an expression that mixed exhaustion with grim satisfaction. "Now comes the hard part." The scene that greeted them in the cargo hold was something out of a disaster movie. The survivors who had made it to the aircraft were a mix of local islanders and international aid workers, all bearing the drawn faces and hollow eyes of people who had seen too much in too short a time. Children clung to parents who looked barely strong enough to stand, while elderly residents were supported by younger relatives whose own strength was clearly failing. The makeshift medical team that had set up in what remained of the missionary hospital worked with desperate efficiency, triaging the wounded and identifying those who needed immediate evacuation. Phoenix moved among them with quiet authority, assessing the situation with the clinical eye of someone who had seen humanity at its most vulnerable. She spoke in rapid Spanish to a family huddled near the loading ramp, her voice gentle but urgent as she explained the evacuation procedures. Then she switched to English to coordinate with the Australian medical team, her commands crisp and specific. "The critical patients load first, stretcher cases in the forward compartment where we can monitor them. Walking wounded in the middle, families with children aft near the ramp." Torres watched her orchestrate the loading process and began to understand something about the woman he was flying with. This wasn't just about flying skill or technical competence. Phoenix moved through the chaos like someone who had spent years in places where organization meant the difference between life and death, where split-second decisions had consequences measured in human lives. She checked each patient personally, making notes on a water-stained pad, ensuring that critical medications were properly secured and that families weren't separated in the confusion. "Ma'am," one of the Australian medics approached her, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you just saved a lot of lives today. We had given up hope that anyone could land in this weather." Phoenix's response was characteristic, no false modesty, no dramatic speeches, just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had done what needed doing. "That's what we're here for, doctor. How many do we need to evacuate immediately?" The doctor consulted his list, and Torres could see the weight of impossible choices written across his features. "Ideally, everyone. But if we're talking about immediate medical necessities, I have 43 patients who won't survive another 24 hours without hospital facilities. The rest," he shrugged helplessly. Phoenix studied the survivors still boarding the aircraft, making rapid calculations about weight, balance, and available space. "Doctor, we'll make room. Even if we have to come back, we'll make room." The loading process took nearly 2 hours, complicated by the storm and the need to properly secure patients who were critically injured. Phoenix worked alongside the medical team, her hands gentle but sure as she helped position stretchers, and ensure that IV lines were properly secured for flight. Torres found himself impressed not just by her flying ability, but by her instinctive understanding of medical procedures and emergency protocols. This was clearly someone who had operated in austere environments where pilots needed to be medics, mechanics, and sometimes soldiers all at once. As the last of the evacuees were brought aboard, Phoenix received an update from the local rescue coordinator that changed everything. "Major, we've just gotten word from the outer island, the one that took the worst hit from the typhoon. They've found survivors, but the situation is critical. No landing zone, no communications, just signal fires on the beach. Estimated 40 people, including children, and they won't last another day." Phoenix closed her eyes for a moment, and Torres could see her running calculations that went far beyond simple flight planning. "How far?" she asked quietly. The coordinator checked his charts. 130 nautical miles southeast. The island is basically just a rock sticking out of the ocean, maybe 2,000 feet at its highest point. No way to land anything larger than a helicopter, and all our rotary wing assets are grounded for maintenance. Phoenix opened her eyes, and Torres saw something there that he was beginning to recognize, the look of someone who had never learned to accept the word impossible. "We'll figure something out," she said finally. "But first, we get these people to proper medical care." As Phoenix began the engine start sequence for their departure, Torres couldn't help but ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "Ma'am, what exactly are you planning for that island? Because from what the coordinator described, there's no way to land." Phoenix's smile was enigmatic, carrying secrets that Torres suspected he wasn't cleared to know. "Lieutenant, there's more than one way to deliver supplies to people who need them. Sometimes you just have to think outside the conventional parameters." The takeoff from the improvised runway was even more challenging than the landing, with the added weight of evacuees and the deteriorating weather conditions. Phoenix coaxed the heavily loaded C-17 into the air with a combination of skill and determination, fighting crosswinds that tried to push them into the tree line. As they climbed away from the island, Torres looked back at the lights below, the remaining survivors who were still waiting for rescue, still hopping for the sound of engines in the storm. The flight to the nearest hospital facility took them through the backside of the weather system, where the turbulence was less violent but the visibility remained poor. Phoenix flew with the steady concentration of someone who had learned that complacency killed, her eyes constantly scanning instruments and weather displays. In the cargo hold behind them, the medical team worked to stabilize patients while dealing with the motion of the aircraft, their quiet professionalism a counterpoint to the drama of the rescue. "Phoenix," Torres said during a brief lull in the weather, "can I ask you something?" She nodded without taking her eyes off the instruments. "Why did you come back? I mean, officially you were dead, your cover was intact, you could have stayed in the shadows indefinitely." Phoenix was quiet for a long time, long enough that Torres thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 7 years' worth of choices that couldn't be undone. "Because I got tired of being a ghost, Lieutenant. Tired of fighting other people's wars in places where victory was measured in small increments of less bad, rather than actually good." She adjusted their heading slightly, tracking toward the beacon of the hospital's landing zone. "When I heard that radio call this morning, when I realized that people were going to die because of bureaucracy and bad timing, it reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. Not for the adrenaline or the glory, but because sometimes you're the only thing standing between innocent people and disaster." The hospital landing zone appeared through the clearing weather like a vision of organized efficiency, proper runway lights, medical vehicles standing by, teams of doctors and nurses ready to receive the evacuees. As Phoenix configured the aircraft for landing, Torres realized that he was witnessing something historically significant. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was the resurrection of a legend, the return of someone who had become more myth than reality in the years since her disappearance. They touched down at the hospital facility with barely a bump, Phoenix's landing so smooth that some of the patients probably didn't even realize they were on the ground. As the medical teams rushed to unload the evacuees, Phoenix sat quietly in the pilot's seat, her hands still on the controls, her eyes distant with thoughts that Tors couldn't begin to fathom. "So what happens now, ma'am?" he asked. "I mean, officially you're still listed as KIA. There's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of paperwork." Phoenix's laugh was soft but carried an edge of steel. "Oh, I'm sure there will be, Lieutenant. But first, we have 40 people on that outer island who are counting on us to figure out the impossible." She began plotting a course on the navigation display, her movements showing the familiar rhythm of someone preparing for another mission. "Besides, I've been officially dead for 7 years. A few more hours of bureaucratic limbo won't hurt anyone." As they prepared for the flight to the stranded survivors, Tors found himself wondering what kind of person voluntarily walked away from safety and anonymity to risk everything for people they had never met. Whatever Phoenix had been through in her 7 years of official death, it had forged her into something extraordinary. Part pilot, part guardian angel, part force of nature that bent reality to her will through sheer determination and skill. The outer island appeared on their navigation display as they flew southeast, a tiny speck of land surrounded by hundreds of miles of empty ocean. From their altitude, it looked impossibly small, a geological afterthought barely worthy of notice. But somewhere on that remote piece of rock, 40 people were fighting for survival, their only hope the sound of aircraft engines cutting through the storm. Phoenix studied the island through binoculars as they circled at low altitude, evaluating options that all looked equally impossible. "There," she said finally, pointing to a section of beach barely visible through the spray. "See those signal fires? The survivors are concentrated on the leeward side, probably sheltering in whatever natural windbreaks they can find." Tors looked where she was pointing and saw only a rough shoreline pounded by surf, with no hint of anything resembling a landing zone. "Ma'am, I hate to state the obvious, but there's nowhere to put this bird down." Phoenix's smile was the expression of someone who had learned to find opportunity in the most desperate circumstances. "Who said anything about landing, Lieutenant? Sometimes the most effective delivery method doesn't require touching the ground." She keyed the radio to contact the Australian rescue coordinator. "Rescue Control, this is Cargo 77 approaching the outer island. Confirm you have no aircraft capable of reaching this location." The response came back immediately. "Negative, Cargo 77. Weather and distance put it beyond the range of our helicopters, and there's nowhere for fixed-wing aircraft to operate. You're looking at the same impossible situation we've been staring at for the past 18 hours. Phoenix absorbed this information with the calm of someone who had built a career on solving problems that had no conventional solutions. "Understood, Control. We'll figure something out. Phoenix out." Tors watched her cycle through displays and checklists, her movements showing the focused intensity of someone preparing for something extraordinary. "Ma'am, what exactly are you planning?" Phoenix's response was characteristically direct. "We're going to do a low-level supply drop, Lieutenant. Get down to about 200 feet, slow to minimum controllable airspeed, and push palletized supplies out the back ramp. Not textbook, not approved by any manual you've ever read, but it's what those people need." The concept was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. Flying a massive cargo aircraft at low altitude over water, in marginal weather conditions, while conducting an improvised airdrop, was the kind of maneuver that ended careers or lives when it went wrong. But Phoenix began the approach with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the day, her hands steady on the controls as she descended toward the wave tops. "Cargo ramp to trail position," she commanded, and Tors complied despite every instinct screaming that this was impossible. The C-17 shuddered as the rear cargo door opened, disrupting the airflow and requiring constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. Phoenix compensated with minute adjustments, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals as she fought to keep the aircraft in the narrow envelope between controlled flight and aerodynamic disaster. At 200 feet above the churning ocean, the world became a blur of spray and motion. Phoenix flew the aircraft with surgical precision, threading between wind shear and wave action while maintaining the exact speed and altitude necessary for the supply drop. Torres watched the altimeter like his life depended on it, calling out deviations that Phoenix corrected before he finished speaking. 50 feet above minimum. 40. Back to 50 steady at 200. The survivors on the beach had spotted them and were waving desperately, their signal fires creating pillars of smoke that marked the target area. Phoenix lined up for her approach run, the massive aircraft skimming over the water like some impossible metal seabird. Supplies away, Torres called as the palletized cargo separated from the aircraft, their parachutes blossoming like flowers against the storm-darkened sky. Medical supplies, food, clean water, and emergency shelter materials drifted down toward the people who needed them most. Phoenix pulled the aircraft into a climbing turn, adding power gradually to avoid stalling the heavily loaded transport. As they gained altitude, Torres looked back through the cargo door to see the supplies landing safely on the beach, the survivors already running toward them. It was a scene that would be etched in his memory forever. The moment when hope literally fell from the sky, delivered by a pilot who refused to accept the word impossible. "Control, this is Cargo 77, Phoenix transmitted as they established a safe cruising altitude. Supplies successfully delivered to survivors on the outer island. Recommend immediate helicopter extraction as soon as weather permits." The Australian coordinator's voice came back filled with amazement and gratitude. "Cargo 77, I don't know how you managed that, but you just accomplished something we thought was physically impossible. Those people owe you their lives." Phoenix's response was typical of her understated professionalism. "Just doing the job, Control. Sometimes you have to improvise when the situation requires it." As they turned toward home, Torres found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed. In the span of 12 hours, he had watched a dead woman return to life, execute 2 impossible missions, and save the lives of people who had been counting their remaining time in minutes rather than days. The flight back to Hickam was conducted in relative silence, both pilots lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired. Phoenix flew with the same steady competence she had shown all day, but Torres could see the exhaustion beginning to show around her eyes, the accumulated stress of a day that had pushed every limit of skill, endurance, and aircraft performance. As the lights of Hawaii appeared on the horizon, he realized that he was about to witness the return of a legend and the inevitable reckoning that would follow. The approach to Hickam was almost anticlimactic after the day's adventures. Phoenix flew a textbook pattern, her landing so smooth that it seemed effortless despite the emotional and physical toll of their missions. As they taxied toward the ramp, Torres could see the crowd that had gathered: base personnel, medical teams, and what looked suspiciously like reporters and military officials. Word had traveled fast about the mysterious pilot who had risen from the dead to save lives. "You ready for this?" Torres asked as they completed the shutdown checklist. Phoenix looked out at the waiting crowd and sighed softly. "No one's ever ready for this kind of attention, Lieutenant, but it's time to stop being a ghost." She gathered her few personal possessions and prepared to face a world that had moved on without her, a military bureaucracy that would demand explanations for actions that defied conventional wisdom, and a future that was suddenly full of possibilities and complications in equal measure. As they walked down the cargo ramp together, Torres realized that he had been privileged to witness something extraordinary, not just exceptional flying skill or tactical innovation, but the resurrection of someone who had chosen principle over safety, mission accomplishment over personal preservation. Phoenix walked toward her future with the same steady confidence she had shown in the cockpit, ready to face whatever consequences her choices might bring. The crowd surged forward as she appeared, voices calling questions, cameras flashing, officials demanding explanations. But Phoenix moved through it all with quiet dignity, her presence commanding respect even from those who didn't understand what they had witnessed. She had been declared dead 7 years ago, but today she had proved that some things transcend bureaucracy, that heroism isn't about following rules but about doing what's right when it matters most. The aftermath would be complicated: investigations, debriefings, medical examinations, and endless paperwork to officially resurrect someone who had never really died. There would be questions about her 7 years in the shadows, demands for explanations that she couldn't or wouldn't give, and challenges to her authority to act without proper authorization. But all of that was tomorrow's problem. Today, people were alive because she had refused to accept impossible as a final answer. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Phoenix stood on the flight line and looked up at the heavens that had been her domain for so many years. Tomorrow she would face the consequences of her choice to step out of the shadows, to reclaim her identity, and accept the responsibilities that came with it. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, she had been exactly where she needed to be. The legend of Phoenix would grow in the telling, passed from pilot to pilot in ready rooms around the world. The story of the dead woman who walked back into a cockpit and saved lives would become part of aviation folklore, inspiring future generations of aviators to push beyond conventional limits. But for those who were there, who witnessed her return and flew beside her on that impossible day, she would always be more than a legend. She would be the embodiment of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to never give up when people were counting on you to do the impossible.